Ecosystem is resilient because it's a CAS, but also the subparts of the ecosystems are often complex adaptive systems, and they also have some kind of built-in resilience by being a complex adaptive system.
Very interesting. Thanks for sharing this. But let me be a little bit of a devil's advocate. I do understand that bees by themselves are quite resilient, and I would agree. But wouldn't you think that the behavior of bees are already quite predictable? Is that one of the aspects, maybe like when you think about the swarm of the bees, they always kind of behave in a certain predictable way?
Yeah, that's also quite a good point, and I would agree that it is kind of predictable, since there is like the beekeeper job and they do know how they swarm and how they behave. But it isn't fully predictable, I would say. So you can't exactly tell at which point these bees are gonna swarm, for example, which in my opinion should be possible when you know the actions of each single bee, right?
Right.
And that's not possible, right? So their overall behavior is predictable, I would say, to some extent, but it is not predictable because we know the actions of the single entity.
I understand that. But that's a really, really interesting point. So before we actually will delve from complex adaptive systems to process management maybe in a little bit, I have a question. Wouldn't be then any CAS be just part of a larger CAS? Because we talked a little bit about the biodiversity and we don't know what would happen if one system, let's say, behaves differently or fails or wouldn't be there. So in that same sense, isn't then any CAS just a part of another bigger CAS?
And yeah, I would totally agree to that as well. Since we could just break it down and look at it from different granularity kind of levels, we could now take the beehive as our complex adaptive system, which has individual agents, but it forms a living organism like the bee state, right? But we could now also go inside of the bee and look at the microscopic level, and we would also see there and that there are many different cells also doing usually the same thing, but somehow ending up at different states than they would have been if we predicted them, for example. And we could also take a look outside of it and take the ecosystem perspective, for example, because also in an ecosystem we have many individual players, like a beehive, like the crops, like some kind of predator, and there's also some impact coming into this ecosystem from the outside. And you could always, I think you could always take this to a higher level. So you could say, okay, an ecosystem is resilient because it's a CAS, but also the subparts of the ecosystems are often complex adaptive systems, and they also have some kind of built-in resilience by being a complex adaptive system. Yeah.
So interesting, but if you think a little bit now, switching over to what we have seen, especially during the pandemic, is that actually our supply chain in global trade has been extremely brittle. I mean, you remember, that one container ship making a wrong turn in the canal, and the entire world economy was impacted. So that's not really, it is definitely complex, I think you would agree, but it wasn't so resilient.
Yes.
So do you have any personal opinion on that, or am I mixing apples and oranges maybe?
Yeah. It is definitely also a point, but I do feel like this resilience isn't universal per se, and the resilience is only relevant and there when the members are similar and have all the same capabilities, and that there's no single point of failure, right? There's redundancy because you have many worker bees and you could take out some worker bees and it would still work, right? And I feel like the thing why you mentioned is we did not have the redundancy in this complex adaptive system of the World Trade. For example, like the canal, which was blocked by the Evergreen, it was not redundant. There was no other canal doing the same thing as this canal. Right. So this is one key factor to the resilience in a complex adaptive system, and why it didn't work in the global trade.
So it was more of a CS, a complex system,
yes.
not so much adaptive, but you're right.
Not so much adaptive, exactly.
I think that's a very good point.
Yeah.
So we have heard about redundancy. We also heard about the nature of predictability, which could be very unpredictable. Is it possible that there is maybe an underlying code, but we just don't know it yet? So, in other words, is there a certain predictability, or do you know if there's any, let's say, arithmetic calculations already that prove that these things are unpredictable by nature? Or is it actually just something we haven't found out yet?
Yeah, so I'm not too sure on the mathematics kind of view if there is already a solution for predicting it. Since it's kind of follow, like, do you know the Monte Carlo simulation? It's quite similar to that, to the unpredictability of the Monte Carlo. Complex adaptive systems match this quite well. Right. And so this would be like the most mathematic terms you could describe it, I guess.
Right.
And the thing is, I really feel like to kind of still try to predict those systems or kind of get some useful information out of them, it is necessary to have a baseline of the most simple rules and also define the most simple objects in a system you want to simulate. For example, there's this cool concept called Boids, which is simulating bird flocks in computers, right? And there are basically just 3 simple principles for simulating bird flocks, which look exactly like real bird flocks in the real world. And there are just 3 simple principles responsible for this whole simulation. And I could go more in that depth in here, but I think it would kind of go over the borders. And I think it's like the real art is to figure out the most simple actions a single agent could take in a complex adaptive system, so we can simulate it accordingly to the real world and then see how the simulation goes and what kind of procedures or processes we could take from the simulation and see, okay, this is working well and we are seeing this over and over, but it has these 2 side effects, for example.
It's very interesting because now you're entering our world in SAP Signavio with the processes. Of course, one of our key topics is also observability, where we also really want to understand how to make better decisions on what we are able or not able yet to observe in terms of all the relationships, in terms of all the correlations, of all the potentially also chaos we have in our processes. But I think maybe coming towards an end, it would be probably interesting to apply some of the CAS literature and theory into maybe business process management. So how could I get started? Do you have any influential books or authors you can recommend for people who want to get started on this topic?
Yeah, so I've actually, in preparation for this talk, also refreshed my mind on this topic, since it's, I've had my own beehive, but it's quite some time ago, right? And it turns out there is a really good TED Talk, especially now on YouTube, which is from Igor Nikolic, I think. It was really inspiring and really showed me also, again, like why this topic is so cool, in my opinion. And also there is this one book I've also read, which is called The Computational Beauty of Nature, which is also all about CAS or fractals and all that kind of stuff. And this is quite a nerdy book, I would say. but it's still really kicked off like the flame in my heart for this topic. So it's still a cool read to get started into this topic. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Lasse. It was really a pleasure. I learned quite a lot of new things related to CAS, and I really hope that maybe in the near future you can share more about this topic. Thanks for being here on the Tea with T.
Thanks for having me.
Right.
Enjoy your tea.
Cheers.